Good afternoon. We will, of course, continue with the course which is related to the approach of Piaget. And in the last session, we mentioned the concept of egocentrism, which is very important in the view of Piaget's approach. And here we mentioned that when the child is leaving the egocentric period, he is not able to take into account the viewpoint of the other person, and this is the main characteristic of egocentrism. And here I think it is important to mention the difference between egocentrism and narcissism, because when the child is leaving egocentrism between mainly 2 years and 7 years, the child is not able to put himself in the cognition of the other, and that's what we mean by egocentrism. In other words, the child is not aware about the standpoint of the other, and the reason why he will not take into account the opinion and the ideas which are elaborated by the other. But when we refer to egocentrism, and that is, of course, when we refer to egocentrism, it is a cognitive issue, and the child is not able from 2 years to 7 years to take into account the standpoint of the other, and we are referring here to the standpoint, cognitively speaking, in terms of idea or ideas, set of ideas, when we are discussing about this or that subject matter or topic, as we mentioned about referring to when we refer to the child who is facing when we refer, of course, to the child, like here, for example, the child is facing the biggest mountain, and on the other side of the table there is a small toy, and here a doll, and this doll is facing a small mountain, and the other one which is bigger than the first one, and the third one is the biggest mountain. but because the child here is seeing just one mountain, and even he before sitting down and before starting to see the biggest mountain, he was able to move from the left side of the table to the right side of the table, and he already saw the three mountains, the smallest one, then the bigger one, then the biggest one. But when he sit down and he is seeing the biggest mountain, and when Piaget asked this child how this doll is seeing the mountain, he said that the doll is seeing just the biggest mountain. And he, in this case, the child is not able to take into account the opinion, the standpoint, the perceptual activity of the doll. And that's what we mean by referring to egocentrism. But when we refer to narcissism, it's an affair of emotion. It means that the subject is loving a lot himself, and even that he can know about the concerns of other or the others, he will not take into account their concerns or their standpoint or their psychological difficulties, etc. And compared to egocentrism, narcissism is an emotional attitude, an emotional position, an emotional psychological position, but egocentrism is a cognitive position. On the other hand, when the child is experiencing egocentrism, he is not aware about the standpoint of the other. He is not able to perceive by his cognition the opinion of the other. But when we refer to narcissism, the person is aware about the psychological difficulties of the other, but he will reject and he will not take into account these difficulties. And this is the main difference between narcissism and egocentrism. Egocentrism is a cognitive position. Narcissism is an emotional position. Egocentrism, the child is not able to know, is not able to be aware about the cognitive position of the other. But when we refer to narcissism, the person know and know the psychological concern of the other, but he will reject these concerns, these emotional concerns, and he will focus just on his own concerns. And this is the difference between egocentrism and narcissism. On the other hand, I think it is important also to mention another point, because taking into account the comparison between the phylogenetic study and the ontogenetic study, And when we refer to egocentrism, which is characterizing the child between 2 years and 7 years, here we are referring to the ontogenetic evolution of the child. On the other hand, we can compare between the study of Piaget and what was described by the French ethnologist and anthropologist, and we can say also philosopher, Lucien Lévy-Bruegel, who lived from 1857 to 1939. And Lévy-Bruegel said that the mentality of primitive tribes and communities are pre-logical and mystical. And here we can compare between the child who is egocentrist, and he will not take into account the standpoint of the other, and consequently he is not thinking in a logical way, as we mentioned in the example previously explained. And this cognitive status of the child could be compared with what Lévy-Bruegel mentioned about the primitive mentality, which is characterizing tribes and classical or primitive communities like in Africa, South Africa, and like also in South America, in Brazil, in Amazonia and other parts, and also in the south of Asia, or in all these in various parts of this these continents. From Lévy-Bruegel, there are various and multiple communities which are characterized by primitive mentality, which means that the primitive mentality is characterized by a pre-logical and mystical status, and which means that there is and here we can mention, when we refer to Lévy-Bruegel, to the importance of the concept of the law of participation. The concept of the law of participation, by which Lévy-Bruegel tried to explain the primitive mentality as a pre-logical and mystical, it referred that the self and the non-self are in one state, are combined, and also what is natural and supernatural could be combined for these people, because even they are living on earth, but they are perceiving the sky and what is behind the sky as it is related to them as people, and what is in the sky and behind the sky is also related to what they can perceive on earth. And this is a pre-logical thinking and a mystical thinking, because they are seeing mystical and the metaphysical powers which are influencing their lives, and which are also influencing physical nature. And for example, there are mystical forces which are influencing the earth and people and animals, etc. And this is a pre-logical thinking and the mystical thinking. And here we can compare between what Lévy-Bruegel found about these primitive people and communities, and what was described by Piaget about the child, referring to the egocentric state that is experienced by the child between 2 years and 7 years. And this comparison emphasize again the importance to compare between the ontogenetic evolution of the human being and the phylogenetic evolution of human being during its history, taking into account multiple centuries that is crossing the history of humanity. This is that's what we can that's what we can refer to when we compare between the ontogenetic evolution and the phylogenetic evolution. On the other hand, in his first books, Piaget considered the development of intelligence as a process of socialization of thought, and he attributed great developmental import to social interactions among peers and between children and adults. In all domains, development went from egocentrism, largely manifested as children's dependence on perceptual appearance and acceptance of external authority, toward logical thinking and cognitive and moral autonomy. Piaget saw such development as a progress from the child and the primitive to the adult and the modern. And here we can mention again the importance to move, the importance for the child to move from the egocentrism, to move from egocentrism as it reflects the dependence of the child to what he perceives as an appearance, what he perceives from the external, from his external interaction with the object, the various objects of the world, and also by accepting external authority. And when the child is moving from egocentrism, he is reaching logical thinking and the cognitive and the moral autonomy, which means that he is thinking in a logical way, he is thinking in an abstract way, rather than to think by focusing on appearance and the external state of the object. And this cognitive and moral autonomy is an autonomy from what from the direct dependence to the external state of the reality, to think independently, which means in an abstract way. And this what characterize the modern man or the modern human being compared to the primitive human being who is influenced by the law of participation, in which all things are related. What is physical is related to what is metaphysical. What is natural is related to what is supernatural. The self is related to other selves. There is no sharp separation between the self and the other, the nature and what is meta-natural, the physical and what is metaphysical, etc. And from this perspective, we can express a sharp difference between what is primitive and what is modern. What is we make also a difference between the law of participation and the law of separation between the self and the other, the nature and the supernature, what is physical and the metaphysical, etc. And this is taking into account Piaget's view, the development and the evolution of the man consists to reach separation between himself and the other, between what is natural and supernatural, between what is physical and metaphysical, etc. And when we move from the law of participation to the law of separation, a human being is evolving, and he is reaching maturity, taking into account Piaget approach about the development of the cognition from the ontogenetic perspective and also from the phylogenetic perspective. And particularly in the origin of intelligence, Piaget elaborated links between biological, epistemological, and psychological theories. He defined the human intelligence as a form of adaptation that prolongs organic adaptation and functions according to the same mechanism, assimilation and accommodation. And we mentioned this earlier, because we referred to the influence of natural sciences and biology, in which Piaget elaborated his PhD thesis. And for Piaget, then a human being, the evolution of a human being consists to reach adaptation, which means to move from what is not organized to what is organized. A human being, the evolution of human being consists to move from the chaos to the order, and that's what we mean by adaptation, the organic and the physical adaptation. Then this organic and physical adaptation becomes gradually a psychological and social adaptation. And this is the human being can reach this various adaptations by applying and by using the mechanism and the process of assimilation and accommodation in an interactive way, and in an interactive process and activity. And this is the main goal to reach, which referring to adaptation. And the adaptation is the external movements, the external positive and constructive interaction between assimilation and accommodation. And when we refer to organization, we are pointing out the interaction between assimilation and accommodation internally. In other words, assimilation, the interaction between assimilation and accommodation, or the interaction between the subject and the object, has a consequence, and this consequence is an external consequence and an internal consequence. The external consequence, which is a construction, the construction of the subject, we name this external construction by adaptation. And when we refer to the interaction between assimilation and accommodation, this interaction between the subject and the object is a positive construction which is named internally by organization. And we have both, where the inter-influence between assimilation and accommodation, or the inter-influence between the subject, the activity of the subject toward the object, and the activity of the object toward the subject, will have a consequence. We'll have two kind of consequences, and not a contradictory consequences. These are two kind of consequence as it refers to a positive construction. There is an internal positive construction which is named by organization, and there is also an external positive construction which is named by adaptation. And both of them are important when we refer to the cognitive construction. That is the goal of the theory of Piaget. And Piaget asserted the primary role of activity and sought to avoid both nativism and empiricism. Piaget he rejected the nativism as an approach, as a set of ideas, which means that the external world doesn't has any influence toward the subject. And also at the same time, Piaget rejected empiricism in terms of referring to the influence, the only influence of the environment toward the subject. And rather than that, he focused mainly on the concept of activity, by which we can see and understand the inter-influence between assimilation and accommodation, or in other words, we can understand the action of the subject toward the object, referring to the activity of assimilation, and at the same time the activity of the activity or the influence of the object toward the subject, referring to the activity of accommodation. And both of them are both of them referring to assimilation and accommodation are implemented by the activity, and there is an inter-influence between assimilation and accommodation between the subject and the object. And by this these concepts and by referring to the importance of both the subject and the object, Piaget was able to elaborate these concepts: assimilation, accommodation, activity, and adaptation and organization, as we mentioned and explained them. And by these concepts, Piaget tried to elaborate a new approach that is named cognitive constructivism. And by this approach, he was able to review and to critique sharply both nativism and empiricism. And he later turned his approach constructivist, or mainly cognitive constructivism. because it assumes that the concept and structures of intelligence are successively constructed and reconstructed by means of the physical and mental activities whereby the organism adapts to the external world. And we can understand here the inter-influence of the external world toward the subject, and at the same time the subject is also influencing the external world, and that's what we mentioned when we refer to the activity that appears between assimilation and accommodation between the subject and the object. And that's what we mean by this approach of Piaget, that is named cognitive constructivism. And thank you for your attention. And also I would like to thank you to follow all these courses, all these sessions of the course that about English language which reflected some explanations about a few approaches that are classical and that are characterizing the field of psychology. And all these approaches, even that referring to behaviorism, psychoanalysis, Gestalt psychology, and cognitive constructivism, all of them are classical, but they are still influencing the horizon and the field of psychology. And it is important to have an idea about these approaches. And thank you again for your attention, and goodbye. Thanks again.